Hello, I'm Toka and welcome back to the second channel video. Today I wanted to talk about the global pandemic the world is currently fighting. You know, the one you can't say the name of on YouTube without getting demonetized, because a lot of people have been enjoying these videos where instead of just diving into a headline figure and saying, hey, we've had 12,000 deaths almost right now, that's really big and scary. Instead, I like to look at the stats and the facts and the situation developing behind it, because obviously the trends and the direction it's going is much more important than the absolute numbers in any situation, even if they are tragic or even if they are very interesting to look at. And that's why in today's video I wanted to talk about the fact that we finally have hit the situation where it is the world that's fighting it. Because here's the US, for instance, but it's not just the US or Africa we're talking about in today's video, it's pretty much the fact that we have now reached the stage where almost every country on Earth has developed some cases, which again, although there are some countries which are healing past it, it has become a global pandemic the world is fighting. There are far more countries with at least a handful of cases than countries which don't have any whatsoever, and that is a very interesting change over just the last couple of weeks. And again, that is a trend which you'll kind of see going forwards here, because we've seen even more crazy measures than we expected before. For instance, the United Arab Emirates, a country that you might not know by itself, but most people know because of its famous exports. I mean, Emirates, the airline, is perhaps the biggest one, but also Dubai is the big city on which Emirates is based. Abu Dhabi or Dubai are both huge cities in the United Arab Emirates, which is kind of it's like the United Kingdom. It's like 7 different emirs all coming together to make a combined kingdom. Weird country, okay, but the UAE has officially done something no other country has done, and they have banned their nationals, their citizens, from leaving the country. This is pretty nutty by itself. The first way, because it makes sense, right? Like, if you ban people from leaving, then they don't have to return, and it stops that whole travel process. But it also is something that is a level of draconian we haven't seen elsewhere, because it's even crazier than that, as well as nationals not being able to leave the country, even if they want to. It's also banning the re-entry of visa-holding residents. If you have a visa of any form, if you live and work in the UAE, just not as a citizen, which is a lot of people, you cannot return. And if you want to get a new visa, all of them have been suspended. If you want to go through the airport to connect somewhere else with Emirates, you can still do that. But right now, if you want to get into the United Arab Emirates, you cannot unless you are a citizen or national or some with connection like that, to one of those, returning from home. That is pretty nutty as far as countries go, and this is actually a ban that makes sense. Again, I hate it's draconian, it's ridiculous. They're the first country in the world, and I hope other countries don't follow. But if you're going to try and ban travel, which a lot of countries have done, the travel industry has shut down, as we've spoken about before here, it does technically make sense to say, hey, you should also stop, you should really shut down the borders as much as you humanly can. And technically speaking, if you have to be that draconian, if you're talking about ways to stop spreading it, and you think that travel is a great way to spread it, then technically speaking, all these people returning home is a huge source of travel, which has led to, Canada has a lot of repatriating Americans, and a lot of countries are kicking out other nationals, which is leading to a lot of Americans coming home. And this is something that is doing a lot to spread, not to stop the virus. Travel restrictions, ironically, in the long run might be great, but in the short run lead to a lot of people returning home, and that is something that I guess is addressed by this, even if I hate it as a whole. It is technically the logical extension of a travel ban. But anyway, with that said, we also have this situation hitting Africa for the first time. So, the Africa cases have officially hit 1,000, which, oh look, it's a big headline number. Wow, and what's this? A big news site saying it. But the thing I found interesting about this was not just the fact that, like, oh yeah, just latch onto the headline number. It's the fact that now 40 of Africa's 54 countries have it. Previously, they were pretty much unaffected. Basically in Nigeria even, which is the 5th most populous country in the world, has also closed its airports to all incoming international flights for 1 month, which is pretty huge when you think about it. And in typical Africa fashion, the sort of thing that really builds distrust between the leaders and the people, 2 heads of state immediately defied the ban that they put into place with that. And yeah, long story short, what I'm just trying to say right here is Africa, this situation is developing all over the world. The Middle East is actually surprisingly hard hit. Africa is starting to get hit quite hard. And long story short, this has become a worldwide situation, which is, simple enough to say, but, once you start to understand that all these places are dealing with their own capacity strains, you can start to understand that, like, yeah, this is a worldwide thing, which is why when you make a comparison to, like, World War without the fighting and the bombs, you're like, oh, yeah, but this is actually worldwide in the way that, certain pandemics from the past kind of have been. So that is a perhaps worrying factor you can look at right there. But I want to talk about the US in particular because at one point, again, I kind of mentioned, it was a China issue. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that. It was a very much localized to China and a few surrounding countries in much smaller doses issue at one stage, and then it expanded very quickly to a few Asian countries, and then expanded very quickly to Europe and just took over Europe with a little, thing over to North America. Now it seems that South America, every single country for the most part, has got themselves some COVID-19 infections, but also you can see how the United States is getting really, really hammered. If we look at, again, I hate to call it this, but it is kind of a leaderboard, right? Like a leaderboard of countries in terms of cases, etc. China's still number one on this, it seems, but also you can, Italy is obviously the close second because they were the first country to have it take hold before anyone knew what was really going on there. But you can see how very quickly the USA is climbing this leaderboard, desperate to go. I mean, not actually desperate to get in first place. We want this to stop. We need to be very clear here with the language. But you can see how the USA is climbing the ranks very quickly. And people hear this, and again, there's huge panics all across the US. I want to talk about the financial impacts later. But as far as like the response of the people, it leads to this very, weird situation where like, oh yeah, do you want to see the fact that, like, even though it seems like America is being very hard hit, the truth is the United States is a very big country and it's hitting certain places significantly harder than others. And that is it's one of two things, right? It's either this is a very localized problem, because 20,000 cases is a lot. I mean, it's scary when you know how fast it spreads and how fast its numbers grown in every other country, and how America is even growing past the trend in terms of overtaking other countries quite rapidly. But the reality is very few metropolitan areas which are hit the very hardest. If we actually look at the cases numbers, you can see how there's a few cases spread around the place, but most of them are in very, very dense areas. In case you're curious as to why it's so densely spread out, honestly, it's a matter of population. Although if you want to be amusing about this, you could be like, haha, look at this map, looks familiar, right? That's right, all the areas that vote blue the heaviest also happen to have the most infections. Aha, the easiest way to prevent the COVID-19 is just to vote Republican, am I right? But the actual correlation here, because whenever I see a map like this, for pretty much anything, you can make the correlation and be like, oh yeah, America has very few population centers and very few things like that. The truth is, people in densely populated areas happen to vote a particular persuasion in most countries, and also people with high population density also leads to very high case rates. And despite the US being very sparsely populated as a whole, in certain areas it's very densely populated, and that's what's leading to this huge infection. So just bear in mind that the actual this is a good map though to prove a point that's happening in most countries. When you look at it on a country by country level, you're thinking, even though these maps are meant to show, oh yeah, within this governmental entity of like Egypt, or within the governmental entity of Indonesia, or the governmental entity of Kazakhstan, within that governmental entity there are some cases within the area they control, but you tend to look at a map like this and be like, oh yeah, it must be evenly spread within them, right? Like like looking at Indonesia, you wouldn't realize that some of the islands don't have any cases at all, actually. And yeah, it's the same with the United States. That, like, when you look at that map and you see them deep red with a lot of cases, with one of the concerning rise in cases, it's really, really big. But the truth is, if you actually again dive back to the information, it's like, oh yeah, it's very there are very few areas of the world like this, and this is why if travel bans are the solution to this, which I don't think they are, I think I think they are a way to slow this down, perhaps. But if travel bans are the solution, then really, like, interstate travel is one of the easiest ways to block this off, right? Like, there are, in particular, like, 5-6 states, Nevada, the Californias, the Washingtons, the Michigans, the New Yorks, etc., where most of this is, technically speaking, that's a thing. And also, this is why social isolation is a big thing. I want to use this map to mention why staying inside seems like it's kind of dumb, right? Like, having this potentially 3 months we're talking about of shutting down the world seems kind of weird until you see a map like this and realize that, like, oh yeah, if you're in the red area, extra important to avoid all the other red people. But if you're in a gray area too, which it seems dumb that, like, someone in super rural South Dakota, I think this is, should have to worry about the, what is that, like 7-ish cases in their state. It seems kind of weird that someone, in a state of 1 million-ish people should worry about the 7 people all the way on the other side. But that's the thing, right? Because you're asymptomatic, if the people who are asymptomatic stay inside, as well as the people who don't want to go into contact with them, if everyone just does it, we have the solution where, like, oh yeah, lots of areas will remain unaffected. The high infection areas are a whole other ballgame, whole other ballpark. That's why, talks of shutting down domestic travel, or talks about this or that have to be, put in place. But a lot of places are currently in a very early stage. In fact, stage 0 of the infection, as you can see, and that is that is the promising news that you won't hear when you just look at the numbers and see that, like, oh god, how has it risen this much since the last video I made was 3 days ago, and I made a joke that it hit 250,000 any day now, and here we are at just under 300,000. Like, it can seem really depressing to see the skyrocketing. This is the graph of people actually infected. Like, this is total cases. This is cases right now concurrently. You can see how it's basically just a straight line upwards. It's very scary, and, like, it's easy to conclude that, like, well, the world is infected. That 3%-ish death rate, it's, currently looking something more along the lines of, like, what is that, 11%? But, again, in reality, it's going to dip to at least 3, potentially 0.8, looking at countries like South Korea and their death rate. But, like, that death rate's just going to hit the whole world now. But the truth is, that isn't a guaranteed thing just yet, because a lot of the world is still at stage 0. Even though within every governmental entity, which makes it way harder because, again, there is no easy way to shut down between states or cities or counties because there's a county map. It is just something to reassure you that, like, hey, if everyone, this is why acting now actually does have an impact. This is why these actions are starting to take place, and it's a reminder that we are in early stages, and hopefully that even though there's lots of undiagnosed tests there, because actually I want to talk about something kind of big, because a lot of people are going to say, hey Toycat, I know you've got this map right here showing all the cases that we know of that have been mapped down into a particular unit, but obviously there's going to be some cases where people didn't know they had it, or people couldn't get tested, etc. And this is something people mention not just for the US but actually for China a lot more, because China has only had 41 cases. They pretty much solved their epidemic. They're on a second wave, and I mentioned this in a video, and in fact every time this comes up, even in casual conversation, it's like, but you can't trust China's numbers, right? And it's such an easy talking point, and the truth is, you cannot trust this number. This is not an accurate number of cases in China. This is not the accurate number of cases in Italy, though, or Spain, or Germany. You can't trust the numbers of any one. You can probably trust the numbers of Western countries that, more than you can trust the ones of authoritarian, totalitarian states on the other side of the world. I agree, but you still can't trust any of the numbers. But what you can do is trust them to an order of magnitude, or to a degree, Like, I do imagine, based on these numbers, that there are more cases in the USA than there is in Norway. I do know, based on these numbers, there are more cases in China than there is in, say, Iran, which, I mean, man, Iran, like, having a rough time, both authoritarian, but also not stopping the spread, right? But, the point I'm trying to say here is that even though we know China fudges the numbers on a lot of things, recently, literally earlier this year, we had the fact that, like, earlier last year, I should say. But literally we found out that, like, China had inflated their GDP for a decade, and they pretended they had like 7% growth. It was actually more like 5. They didn't actually want this. It was a local government blah blah blah, blah issue, but it still was overstated by 12%. And you might say, haha, caught them in a lie. They managed to inflate one of their big measures by a huge amount. I would say in reality this is because so much of China's local infrastructure is like based on, like, you need this % growth so we can get this % growth. It's called Goodhart's law, where, like, if a measure becomes a target, it stops being a good measure. If you're going after GDP growth instead of actual economic growth, it's obviously not going to work quite so well, and that's the whole thing here. But in the case of these numbers, obviously China is probably putting pressure on people to ease the number of cases, so, a lot of cases might not be diagnosed, but the general case of, the general number of active cases going down is something that makes sense. Why would China lie and say they have the most cases in the world, and then also why would they lie about having a second, very minor infection wave? It doesn't make too much sense. Why would they lie about, having, well, until recently, was a huge death toll from this. And if this was the case, that they hadn't gotten rid of most of it and they've started easing up the restrictions, then in that case, why would they start easing up the travel restrictions within China while there are a lot of people infected that they're just not telling us about? It's the sort of thing that's like, man, it's possible that China is lying about everything, but to a degree you can trust numbers. These numbers aren't perfectly accurate, but they're a representation, a picture of the current situation, and that is why the numbers are important in this sort of thing. If you don't trust these numbers, maybe you trust, and also, like, one of the things here is like, oh yeah, the thing that is a better indication of, like, can you test something, is how well our country's testing. So we don't have numbers for China, sadly, which is, I mean, again, China data is hard to get a hold of. Who would have figured? But what we do have is total COVID-19 tests. You can see how South Korea is probably the country we can trust the most because they have the most tests, which means from those tests, if you trust the test, we have the most data, which tells us that the number in South Korea of about 9,000 infected, pretty close to accurate. Again, I mean, there's some people who wouldn't be tested. You can see that Germany has been testing a lot of people. Russia, Australia, Canada, the US and the UK, etc. We have a lot of tests. The US a very low amount compared to its. Again, the US has had a high proportion, which tells you that if they did more tests, they might find more. Russia's had a very low proportion, which tells you if they did more tests, it might have a similar result, or it might go even lower. For instance, because again, the groups they're testing. What I'm trying to say right here is we have the degree of accuracy, and the reason I don't mention it too often is because, in general, it's very weird to also look, by the way, active cases. China is like all the way down here, and maybe they're lying to make it seem that way. But in this current, it isn't doing them any favors right now, given that the world has shut down with or without them. And if they're unshutting down right now, it's not going to help them regardless, because China has such an export-based economy. Anyway, we dive into economies and stuff. Someone's just going to say, haha, you fell for CCP communist propaganda. And it's like, no, not a fan of the authoritarian stuff. I hate that the authoritarian stuff seems to have worked for China. And I would love for the numbers to be fake too, but I don't think they are. And that is what I'm trying to say here. So with that said, should we dive into some other things today? Because I want to talk about the fact that YouTube videos of coronavirus are being demonetized. It sounds like it's kind of fake, and obviously I wouldn't believe it if a YouTuber said it, but here you can see I released a video saying what long-term impact is corona going to have. I literally said corona, by the way. I didn't even say coronavirus. I think I put COVID-19 the first time, but it got demonetized, and then they confirmed by manual review it's not suitable for advertisers. Same thing with countries shutting their borders. Confirmed by review, nah, no revenue for you, friend. They do it once you upload the video as unlisted, they say this is good to monetize, and then 5 minutes later they're like, ooh, we're gonna take that money back. It's kind of a crazy, weird situation that YouTube is in with this, and I guess I kind of understand it, but just so you know that I'm being honest, I'm not making these videos for a profit. That's not my intention. A lot of people do just say they enjoy the more rational discussion we do here. And also, just to prove that this isn't just this one channel, because oh yeah, this is kind of we are talking about it in a more geopolitical sense. I just mentioned Corona in the video where I was talking about it in relation to Minecraft news. Bear in mind, my main channel, Minecraft stuff, it's considered brand safe by, because I got very lucky, I guess, in that people consider it to be oh yeah, it's just a safe, happy, fun game. So on my main channel, I've uploaded 5,000 videos. I've had no demonetizations besides in cases where I literally stole other content. I would say I packaged it in funny names, but it's this is music, sure, of course it's demonetized. This is just the sound repeated, sure. Sound repeated, sure. This is a high quality video. Can we take a quick step and just be yeah, let's watch my video of how to put Modern Warfare 3 on the iPhone? Because man, am I a good video maker, as you can see. High quality, high effort. Make sure to smash that like button, am I right? But yeah, as you can see, the only video that's been demonetized in 8 years has been this one where I just say cancelled by coronavirus, which was a true thing. Because yeah, I mean, actually, should we just mention a lot of things are being cancelled, including things related to Minecraft. Wow, my life is affected by this too. Who would have assumed? So, to bring that away from it, because I know a lot of people have no idea what the Minecraft channel is, let's talk about what this really all means. Because stuff like that being cancelled, stuff everyone staying inside is having a huge, global economic impact. Obviously, tourism is something we've mentioned time and time again. So I'll just say real quick, we've got the estimates that right now looks like 1 million tourism jobs a day are being lost to the pandemic. Just again, you might think it says 1 million jobs a day. It's oh, that's not too bad. That's 1 million jobs a day in the travel and tourism sector alone. Obviously, that's worldwide, but 1 million jobs a day. The impact of, again, the very scary impact and rising of, the number of deaths being close to 1,000 a day. In fact, rising above 1,000 a day in some cases is huge. And now that is, again, the levels we're at right now are very, very terrifying, of course. But also, what it should be what is also terrifying is the 1 million people a day who cannot provide for themselves every single day. Because hotels, what can they do? International domestic flights, not existing. Cruise lines have all basically had to shut down. And this means not only do the travel industries themselves, but anything that relies on them. Anyone who, directly or indirectly profits from tourism, they're basically all gone. And that is kind of a big deal, because you might think tourism is a small thing. No, most developed economies rely pretty heavily on tourism. Even though the US has a policy of trying to keep people out as much as they can, they still are the 3rd most visited country in the world. 80 million people come through the doors and buy things, which counts as an export for the US, because when a tourist comes in to buy, because they're a foreigner buying things, even if they physically are in your country, it's still an export. And one of the biggest sources of exports for France, Spain, the US, China, it's funnily enough, these line up so closely with the COVID-19 stats and with the largest economies. But all of these countries obviously are going to suffer tourism-wise 2019 to 2020, and that is going to be a huge dent. But a huger dent, you could perhaps say, is based on, Goldman Sachs estimates. Again, can you trust them? Wow, big banks, they so bad, am I right? But can you, based on their estimates, here is what unemployment looks like on a, like adjusted by quarter, kind of basis. Here is what it looks like from the past week in the United States alone. This is crazy in terms of like the impact that it's having on the economy as a whole, because so many sectors, it's not just, by the way, travel, which is being affected now because of the self-isolation. Stay indoors so that, people from the areas in over here don't get to your areas or whatever it may be. Even though because of the self-isolation for that, the result is that a lot of jobs are being added and removed all over the place. Huge sectors are being impacted. There are actually companies who win from this. There's going to be a lot of companies making huge profits. Supermarkets in the UK are famous for this, but like supermarkets anywhere in the world are going to be making a lot of money. Video games, theoretically YouTube, although I'd like to point out just in case, because everyone always says to me like, oh, you must be doing really good right now. Just if you want to see like money. It doesn't actually like correspond with Corona at all. It corresponds with releasing videos, but because those videos aren't monetized, you can see how views go up, but revenue does not follow it. So just maybe a relevant fact, maybe a not relevant fact. Views don't seem to be hugely up as a thing, although almost 100,000 subscribers subscribe to the video if you've watched 22 minutes of me rambling about diseases and YouTube stats and linking them together. But yeah, jobs are being lost all over the world. It's a scary thing, and jobs are being added in other places, but at a much smaller quantity. I mean, Amazon's hiring 100,000 workers, but that's a tenth of a day of the collapse of the tourism industry. So yeah, all I want to say here to kind of finish this is, if one of the things I even said in the video I released on the main channel that got demonetized is at a while ago, whether it was 2, 3, 4 weeks, this was a pretty small deal. Even now, actually, just to mention, I'm saying this to keep, again, someone's going to get mad and be like, it's not like this. But, like right now, it's easy to look at the 12,000 deaths and be like, but if you look at the seasonal flu, let's look at the 2018-19 flu season, you can be like, but that 2018-19 flu season killed 61,000 people. In fact, back a couple of weeks ago, this was on track to kill significantly fewer people. So why do we, it's basically just the flu. It's less than the flu, right? I mean, I remember the last time the flu shut down 1 million tourism jobs and also crashed the stock market. Here's the last month or so of the FTSE 100. I remember that the flu shut down the NBA, the NFL, every sports league for the most part. But yeah, this is a big deal because of how humans are reacting, which hopefully eventually cuts down the spread. Because if you look at the graphs and the stats, every day we are in a terrifying situation that we need to get a grips on. And that is why, measures that are in place need to be put in place, I would say. Also, just a reminder, this graph, this is such a bad map, in my opinion. There's just too much information. Just some good news. One, there's no reported cases on the ISS. There's no coronavirus in space, so we are good, friends. And also, right now, it's still only 0.004% of the world population. It's rising a little bit every day. But, yeah, we are still a little bit away from, like, oh god, everyone's going to die forever, because the real panic is if everyone gets it all at the same time. As long as the spread is slow, eventually hopefully stops, but even if the spread continues, as long as it continues at this set pace, we will continue to be fine. And that's why people say flatten the curve. I hate that as it's just a generic measure, but what you are trying to do is say, hey, this is going to infect a lot of us now. Let's try and, any measure you can do to decrease it, personally, professionally, whatever else, is something you should be doing. Because even though it's not a big deal yet, what's ahead of us now in the next 2 weeks can be a very, 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 very big deal. And that is why governments are worldwide taking action, literally worldwide, because, yeah, this has somehow become a worldwide issue in, again, mostly it seems like the free countries. And just at the end, I just want to posit a thought here, because at the end of the last video, we mentioned how, like, oh yeah, with the exception of China where it started, and, they've kind of locked that down, it is mostly spread into very free countries. I mean, if you compare the freedom index to countries of, COVID-19, it's a pretty close one-to-one overlap. I mean, Russia doesn't have it, Western Europe does. North America has it, with exceptions and Central America being big exceptions right there. Australia, New Zealand, you can see almost again very close to one-to-one correlation. But most of the time in history, there's been the like people always talk about how people will die for your struggle, right? People have died for your right to vote. People have died for your freedoms, and the previous world wars, if you want to compare it to that, have all been about people dying or sacrificing lives in exchange for the freedoms we take for granted. In this situation, we're sacrificing our freedoms to save some lives, and it's a weird one to say out loud, and it makes you question, like, why is it this way this time around? Have we changed as people? Is this the right way? Was it wacky of us to do it the other way around before? Or is this the wacky one? Is this the strange thing? Will this actually be remembered? Because, as I mentioned in the last video, the coronavirus pandemic won't go down in history. It will be a thing. The events that result from it might be a big deal. But the truth is, in a year or two, this kind of will just fade into the background. But the big things you need to remember are the impacts we have afterwards. Again, flattening the curve, or, like trying to reduce the number of cases, very important. Just as important, in my opinion, is the world we come out of this with. And it's very important to focus on making sure that world is the best world it can be, and being very careful not to overreact long term. Any measures should be temporary, is what I'm trying to say. And that is something you should have in your head about any of these emergency things, about like encryption breaking, or about mobile phone data. These things should have very clear, very fixed end dates. Because again, if we're sacrificing freedom for lives, then what is a life without freedom? That is my opinion. I personally value freedom highly. Maybe you don't. Let me know. But for now, second channel. Check out the Reddit link down below if you want to have a calm, easy discussion, as opposed to a holy god, the world's on fire, we're all gonna die discussion. Oh god, we hit 12,000 deaths. Wait, actually, we refresh the page to the deaths. Oh god, they do go up when you refresh the page. It's scary to look at. That during the course of this video, 800 new deaths have been reported, and almost 300,000 cases. It can be scary to look at, and it's a thing you should get out of the habit of doing. Let's have calm discussions about where we're going. Let's stay indoors, and let's watch some internet videos. Am I right? Yeah, I'm right. Second channel. I care about all of you. Slightly. Goodbye.